I never thought a birthday could feel like a trap. On my sister's 25th, my parents demanded I hand over a BMW from the trust my grandfather left me. My inheritance, my freedom. When I refused, they made sure I paid the price, and I ended up in the ER, bleeding and silenced. But hours later, my lawyer arrived with a court order that flipped everything upside down. For the first time, my parents weren't in control, and when they saw the papers, their faces went pale. This is the story of the night I finally reclaimed my life. I learned early that in my family, visibility was a privilege and silence was the rule. Not all silences are equal. Some were gilded, some were loaded with expectation. Some, I discovered later, were designed to break you without leaving a mark. My name is Isabella Hartley. From the outside, my life looked perfect, and my family's home was the epitome of suburban success. 3 stories of brick and glass, trimmed hedges like soldiers in formation, balconies polished until they reflected the California sun. From a distance, you would have thought we were happy, that every smile was genuine, every meal harmonious. But inside, the air felt tight, measured, as though every breath had to be earned. My father, Henry Hartley, ran a small but successful investment firm. Precise, imposing. He managed every part of our lives with the meticulousness of a man who built towers and roads with his hands but wanted to control even our smallest decisions. My mother, Caroline, curated every social interaction and domestic detail with the finesse of a professional event planner, except the events were our lives. And then there was my sister, Miranda. The golden standard. Perfect grades, perfect appearance, perfect accomplishments. In their eyes, she was a beacon, the child to be celebrated, revered, and protected. And I was the shadow, the one who existed to reflect their light and remain unseen. My childhood was a series of lessons in invisibility. I learned to speak softly, to laugh quietly, to blend into the corners of rooms where I wouldn't draw attention. When my successes were ignored and Miranda's were praised, I nodded and smiled. When my suggestions were dismissed as naive or unnecessary, I absorbed it, told myself it didn't matter. I had to be quiet, because noise brought consequences. Small at first, but cumulative, corrosive, and invisible until they weren't. Even holidays were rehearsed. Birthdays became tests of endurance. My own birthdays often went unnoticed while my parents organized elaborate parties for Miranda, complete with cake, gifts, and a long list of carefully chosen guests. I learned to watch from the sidelines, feeling joy and resentment collide in ways I didn't yet understand. Then my grandmother, Eleanor Hartley, passed away. She had been my sanctuary, the one person in the world who saw me. Her house smelled like vanilla and old books. When I was there, I didn't have to hide. She understood my silences. She whispered truths that resonated long after I left her living room. Her passing brought something unexpected. She left me a portfolio of rental properties and a guardianship fund, legally structured in a way that my parents could never access without my consent. My grandmother's lawyers had followed her instructions to the letter. The trust would release in full when I turned 24, or earlier under conditions of hardship, a clause she insisted on including. It was more than money or property. It was leverage. It was freedom she had whispered about years before. Isabella, freedom is only real if you can stand on your own. Guard it like it's life itself. I didn't understand the weight of those words until much later. By the time I turned 23, I was working part-time at a local art museum, saving and managing my grandmother's assets quietly. My parents had no idea. I had learned to move silently, to manage my life without confrontation. But deep down, I always knew I would need this leverage. The tipping point arrived with Miranda's 25th birthday. The party was staged to perfection. Chandeliers glittered under the vaulted ceilings, golden balloons hovered near the ceiling, a string quartet hummed softly in the corner. The guests murmured compliments, as if the house itself had been built to accommodate their admiration. I arrived late, wearing muted colors and trying to disappear into the shadows. I was invisible, as I had always been trained to be. Then it happened. My father, glass raised, looked around the room. To Miranda, he said, voice smooth and practiced. Our pride, our guiding light. And to her sister Isabella, who will ensure she gets what she deserves. The words hit like a knife. The room erupted in laughter. Guests clinked glasses, believing it was a joke. It wasn't. My pulse slowed, my smile froze. Their expectation was tangible, suffocating, as if my only role was to submit without question. For a fraction of a second, I considered laughing it off, playing along, surviving the evening as I always had. But something inside me had shifted. The quiet endurance I had mastered for decades faltered, replaced by a sharp, unignorable awareness. This was wrong. I said no. Just the word, simple, calm. No, the world seemed to pause. My mother's smile froze midair. My father's face hardened. Miranda's eyes widened, disbelief mixing with anger. Silence settled over the backyard like a thick fog. I didn't flinch. Later, I would remember the sound of the glass breaking when I turned away and walked out, accidentally knocking over a champagne flute. The world didn't shatter. It merely reminded me that I was no longer invisible. Hours later, I found myself in the ER, sent there by my parents under the pretense of fainting, though the fainting was staged more for drama than necessity. My face throbbed from a slap delivered in anger. My ribs ached from the tension I had held in all evening. The nurses looked at me with quiet concern, but no one dared interfere in my family's affairs. Then my lawyer arrived. Patrick Delaney had reviewed my grandmother's trust and the guardianship fund in full. In that moment, the leverage I had always known existed became actionable. Under the hardship clause, I had full control of all properties and funds. Any attempt by my parents to coerce me into using the assets would be legally blocked immediately. Later, I watched the fallout from a distance. Caroline clutched her pearls like they were armor, pacing back and forth. Henry's hands trembled as he tried to compose an explanation that didn't exist. Miranda's smirk had disappeared. Their carefully curated illusions were cracking, and the world didn't yet know it. I spent the following days reviewing every document, every contract, every rental agreement tied to the properties. Each line confirmed what I had long suspected. My parents had treated the guardianship fund like a personal bank account, dipping into it for renovations, vacations, and gifts, all without my knowledge. It was more than theft. It was a declaration that they believed my grandmother's foresight and my autonomy were theirs to manipulate. I created spreadsheets, compiled evidence, and contacted Delaney. Each step I took was deliberate, a quiet reclamation of the life I had been denied. I didn't act out of vengeance. I acted out of necessity, protection, and the principle that some lines, once crossed, demand accountability. Meanwhile, the Hartleys scrambled. Every dinner guest, every neighbor, every social connection that had once been a lever for control became a theater of panic. Henry muttered about public perception, about saving face. Caroline fretted over social gossip. Miranda scrolled her phone incessantly, trying to maintain a sense of control that was slipping through her fingers. I watched from my apartment as the first small pieces of justice began to take effect. Delaney filed the necessary legal documentation, freezing all access from my parents. Restraining orders were prepared, ensuring my physical and financial safety. The property deeds, once a hidden security, now became a shield. Those nights were long and quiet. I sat by the window in my small apartment, watching streetlights flicker against the wet pavement, feeling a freedom that was unfamiliar but intoxicating. I traced the lines of my grandmother's handwritten notes, the letters that had been passed to Delaney, the foresight that had allowed me to survive my family's control. For the first time in years, I realized I didn't have to be afraid. Not really. The fear I had carried was real, but it was also a product of manipulation, a shadow my parents had cast over my life. The trust, the guardianship fund, the legal protection. These were tools, yes, but more importantly, they were proof that I could act, that I could reclaim my voice, that I could finally step into the space I had always been denied. By the end of those first long nights, I felt something I had never felt before. Clarity. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind, no longer a distant whisper but a clear command. Freedom is only real if you can stand on your own. Guard it like it's life itself. And that is exactly what I was beginning to do. The morning after the birthday confrontation, I woke in my small apartment to the hum of the city below. Sunlight spilled across the thin curtains, casting patterns on the wooden floor. I felt something I hadn't in years. Quiet. Safe quiet. Not the suffocating silence of my childhood home, where stillness meant judgment, but a silence that belonged to me. I dressed quickly, checking the documents Delaney had left on my desk. Copies of the trust, guardianship fund records, property deeds, all ready for action. My hands moved methodically, almost automatically. Each page represented not only proof but power. A shield against a family who had made me feel disposable. By mid-morning, Rowan and Associates called to confirm that the legal freeze on the trust and fund had been activated. Any attempt by my parents to access accounts, sell properties, or coerce me would trigger immediate intervention. Finally, the leverage my grandmother had left wasn't theoretical, it was enforceable. I decided to confront the Hartley family, but not recklessly. This wasn't about theatrics. This was about exposing the truth while keeping myself untouchable. Driving up the long tree-lined avenue to the family estate, I noticed the neat lawns and the iron gates gleaming. From the outside, everything was calm and perfect. But inside, chaos was already brewing. Henry paced the living room like a man unmoored. Caroline clutched a silk scarf and adjusted her pearls nervously, murmuring to Aidan about damage control. My brother scrolled his phone, fingers tense, jaw tight. When I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Every eye turned, recognition and fear mingling. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. My presence alone unsettled the carefully constructed balance they had relied upon for decades. I have something to discuss, I said, voice steady. Patrick Delaney and I have reviewed the trust and guardianship fund. Under the hardship clause, I now have full control of all properties and funds. You no longer have access. Caroline gasped, clutching the silk scarf to her chest. Henry's face went red, then pale, a flicker of panic in his eyes. Aidan froze mid-scroll, disbelief breaking through his usual arrogance. You, what? Henry said, voice trembling but attempting authority. Isabella, this is ridiculous. You can't just. Yes, I can, I interrupted, calm but firm. Grandma anticipated this. She left clear instructions for situations like tonight. 4 years, you've treated my inheritance, my autonomy, like they were yours to manipulate. That ends today. Caroline stepped forward, trying the soft, coaxing tone she used to mask coercion. Sweetheart, please. It's family. Don't make this public. Don't humiliate us. I shook my head. It's already public. In this room, the truth is finally visible. 4 decades, I've been the invisible child. Tonight, I'm seen. Tonight, I act. The people who care will understand that what you call obedience was control, manipulation, and theft. Henry's face tightened. You'll regret this. You'll come crawling back. You can't survive without us. I smiled faintly. I've survived without you my entire life. This time I have proof, and the law is on my side. I set the folder containing all the evidence on the marble coffee table. Photos, bank statements, property deeds, and screenshots of communications detailing their unauthorized spending from my grandmother's guardianship fund. Caroline lunged, trying to snatch the papers, but I stepped back. Hands off. I warned you. These are now legal documents. Any interference is actionable. Aidan's smug confidence faltered as he realized none of his usual tricks would work. He stammered. But, you're our sister. Family. I am your sister, I replied, and the law recognizes my rights now. Your version of family, where obedience equals love, ends here. The confrontation was intense but controlled. No shouting matches, no tantrums. Just the undeniable truth standing in front of them. And it worked in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. The color drained from their faces, their carefully maintained poise cracking with every word. I spent the next hours detailing every transaction, every property they had touched without my consent. Henry tried to argue, claiming expenses were justified, but Delaney's explanation was clear. Any use of the guardianship fund without Isabella's approval constituted financial abuse. Caroline's soft protests devolved into silence. She realized the power play she had counted on for years had failed. Aidan muttered, "This isn't fair," but there was no audience to validate him. No one was laughing. No one could restore the narrative they had built. By late afternoon, Delaney began filing requests for permanent control over the trust and guardianship fund. Simultaneously, the temporary restraining order became official, ensuring I had complete protection from coercion or harassment. The legal system, which my parents had assumed they controlled through their social standing, now stood firmly behind me. The real shock came later that evening. I decided to return to the house, not to surrender but to witness the consequences firsthand. I walked quietly through the familiar driveway, noticing for the first time how hollow it all seemed. The gates, the polished exterior, the manicured lawns, they looked like props in a house built to impress strangers. Inside, the silence was thick, oppressive, unlike the tense expectancy of a birthday party. Caroline and Henry were seated on the living room sofa, their expressions unreadable. Aidan leaned against the wall, scrolling his phone, but even he couldn't mask the tension. I placed the folder on the coffee table again, letting it speak for me. "I want you to understand," I said slowly. "Everything you did to control me, to manipulate me, is now documented. Every dollar, every attempt, every threat. And legally, it's enforceable. You cannot touch my inheritance. You cannot coerce me. You cannot lie about what I own." Caroline tried one last soft plea. "Isabella, please, think of the family. Think of our name, our reputation." I shook my head. "I've thought about it for 24 years. And the family you've created, where I am meant to be invisible and compliant, is a family I can leave behind. Reputation means nothing if it's built on coercion and theft." Henry's hands trembled on the armrests of the sofa. "You've turned everything upside down," he whispered. I smiled faintly. "No. I've simply stepped out of your blueprint." Then came the first practical test of my authority. I signed the final transfer orders for all properties tied to the guardianship fund, ensuring my parents could not sell, access, or manipulate them. The signatures carried more weight than any speech, more power than any confrontation. Each stamp, each line inked, was a reclamation of control over a life that had been dictated for decades. Weeks passed. The Hartleys were forced to face the consequences of their actions in the community. Their social circles, once their armor, became mirrors reflecting the truth. Friends, neighbors, and acquaintances learned of the trust dispute and the birthday confrontation. Richard's reputation as a reliable businessman faltered. Caroline's curated image of perfection and benevolence eroded. And Aidan, the golden child, discovered the reality of privilege when scholarship committees and family associates questioned the integrity of his upbringing. I did not gloat. I watched from my apartment as their world unraveled, not out of vengeance, but as a natural consequence of truth. Meanwhile, I settled into my new life, learning to trust myself. The small apartment on Maple Street became a sanctuary. Walls that once felt bare now felt like a canvas for my choices. Each morning, I brewed coffee, sat by the window, and allowed myself the simple pleasure of decision-making. No one telling me what to do, no expectations beyond what I chose. I took control of the guardianship properties carefully, managing tenants, overseeing maintenance, and securing their value. It was laborious at first, but empowering. Each successful management decision reinforced the knowledge that I was capable. I was no longer just Isabella Hartley, background child. I was Isabella Hartley, owner, decision-maker, and finally free. Months later, my lawyer confirmed that all transfers were finalized. The trust was fully under my name. My parents' attempts to intervene had failed. Every document, every legal challenge, had reinforced my autonomy. The feeling was intoxicating, not revenge, not power, but clarity and liberation. I met with Mrs. Kemp, the librarian who had once guided me through early adulthood. I shared everything with her. She listened quietly, her hands folded over mine. "You've done something most people never dare to do," she said softly. "You've claimed your life." And it was true. The claim wasn't just about property, trust, or money. It was about being seen, acknowledged, and respected. Freedom isn't loud, I realized. It's deliberate. It's methodical. It's walking into a room you were once afraid of and leaving on your terms. The Hartleys eventually receded from my life, not by my choice but by the consequences of their own actions. They remained, in a sense, a family I once belonged to, but the connection that had demanded obedience and invisibility was gone. I wasn't angry anymore. I was free. I created a small foundation in my grandmother's honor, assisting young adults navigating family control or financial abuse. It was my way of channeling the lessons I had learned, of giving to others what my grandmother had given me: foresight, preparation, and belief in one's own strength. Sitting at my window one evening, watching the city lights reflect off wet pavement after a sudden rain, I understood something essential. Freedom is not inherited, it is claimed. Justice is not always loud. It can be quiet, precise, unyielding. And survival is not measured by compliance but by knowing when to step out of the shadows. I closed my laptop, the soft click echoing in the apartment that belonged entirely to me. I poured a glass of water, leaned back, and allowed myself a small smile. For decades, I had been invisible, controlled, and silenced. Tonight, I wasn't. I was Isabella Hartley. And this time I owned everything. Not just the properties, not just the trust, but my voice, my life, and my choices. Moral lessons. This story reminds us that family ties don't give anyone the right to control or manipulate you. Saying no isn't selfish. It's an act of self-respect. Protecting what's yours, whether it's an inheritance, your time, or your peace, is never wrong. True strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quietly reclaiming your life, setting boundaries, and refusing to let abuse define you. If you've ever been pressured, silenced, or undervalued, remember. You have the right to stand firm, seek help, and walk away from people who choose power over love. Your dignity and freedom are worth fighting for.